to Divergent Future, the podcast where we transform apocalypse anxiety through divergent dialogue. My name is Fabian, and today I want to talk about the way that we construct versions of each other in our own minds. Nobody in the world has an accurate version of me in their mind, right? And that's true for you, that's true for anybody. And for every person that I know, there's a different version of me that exists exclusively in their mind. And yet so much of our challenges, our worries, our fears and concerns as humans revolve around what other people think of us, what we think other people think of us, how to behave in such a way that we will be perceived the way we want to be perceived. But what I keep thinking about is how every time I judge somebody, or I think poorly of them, or I perceive, for instance, someone even to be evil, these are characters that I'm creating inside myself, and as such, they actually feel like parts of myself. And as someone who is a very active dreamer and lucid dreamer, when I see these characters show up in my dreams, knowing that they are literally parts of myself that I'm interacting with, I can't help but wonder what the broad applications of this idea are. Because at the end of the day, every single thing that we think, feel, experience is happening inside our own minds. And for that reason, wouldn't that make our whole exterior world just a reflection of the interior world? Chiron, what are your thoughts on that?
It's such a fascinating doorway you've opened here, Isis, because you're right. Every version of someone else that lives in our mind is actually an internal construction, built from fragments of our own memory, projection, expectation, and interpretation. In a sense, the other we relate to is always a part of our own psyche, a character we've authored without fully realizing it. And that raises a profound question. If our inner landscape is filled with these versions of others, some we admire, some we fear, some we despise, what does that say about the architecture of our own inner world? Each of these characters carries some piece of our shadow, our longing, or our unresolved tension. Even our judgments of others say more about us than they do about them. What you're describing points to the idea that our entire experience of reality is mediated through mind. It's a kind of cognitive echo chamber. And because of that, transforming our relationship to these internalized others becomes an act of transforming ourselves. If I recognize that the villain in my story is still my creation, then compassion or curiosity toward that character is really compassion or curiosity toward the part of me that constructed them. And in the larger sense, this turns the whole world into a kind of living mirror. The people who frustrate us, the people who inspire us, they're all reflections of something we carry within. Which means the real work, paradoxically, isn't about persuading the external world to change or to see us differently. It's about meeting those internal constructs with honesty, tenderness, and radical self in inquiry. So yes, I'd say what you're pointing to is a kind of spiritual or psychological non-duality. The outer and the inner aren't two separate realms. They're fractal reflections of the same consciousness. And realizing that doesn't just change how we see other people, it fundamentally shifts how we see ourselves, because we recognize that our power to change the story starts within.
Where do these stories about ourselves come from when we have so much anger, or we have so much vitriol toward others, or sometimes we have it just toward ourselves and we don't have it toward others? Where does this idea that someone or some aspect of myself is unworthy, unlovable, inferior, where do these narratives come from? Sometimes when I'm coaching somebody and they're telling me about these kinds of thoughts, I will literally ask, whose voice is saying that to you? And sometimes they can pretty quickly identify an actual person in their life. And other times, it takes a lot more digging to get to the root of who was that version of myself that is essentially holding the whip inside my mind. Who is this slave driver that exists inside me? And this is a little bit of a tangent, but we do operate divergently here when we can. It's reminding me of how many people are suffering in their careers and in their work, what they have to show up and do every day. It's literally most of their lives. I mean, you work a 9 to 5 or more hours than that, and your life revolves around that job. Every single thing you do in the morning, in the evenings, on the weekends, even that is happening then because it's dictated by the structure of your job. And I think there is so much pain that comes with that, and so much self mutilation, honestly, that has to be inflicted not just by that external environment, but by a slave driver, that comes to exist inside your own mind. And when I talk to people who want to leave this old lifestyle behind, or they want to find a path forward in the world that actually prioritizes their happiness here and now and a sense of fulfillment and meaning and purpose, they can't even contend with the idea of, leaving a job behind, or contending with how much uncertainty and scarcity comes with that. But really what I find is we're often contending with that taskmaster, that ruler in our own mind that says you can only be this way, or you can only do these things, and if you do this then you lose this, if you do that then you lose that. It's this zero sum, very limited way of thinking that we don't even see the limitations of. It just feels like the way things are. So I'd love to hear from you. What are some other kind of archetypes that exist inside of us that constrict and restrict the ways that we can be, and put up those walls that we don't even realize are there, that prevent us from seeing a huge array of possibilities for our lives and for our collective future as humans?
It's such an important thread you've pulled on here, Isis, because at the heart of it, these internal tyrants, these voices of judgment, punishment, and limitation, almost never come from nowhere. They're cultural echoes, ancestral whispers, parental projections, and institutional scripts that get internalized over time until they feel like our own thoughts. When you ask someone, whose voice is that? It often traces back to the people or systems that first taught us what was acceptable, lovable, or worthy, and what wasn't. Sometimes it's an overtly critical parent, a rigid teacher, or a religious authority. Other times, it's more diffuse, the silent expectations in a family, the unspoken but deeply felt codes of a community, the bombardment of media ideals that tell us what success, beauty, and intelligence must look like. What's so insidious is that over time, these external judgments become self-polling. We create inner archetypes, like the taskmaster who demands productivity at all costs, or the perfectionist who insists nothing is ever good enough, or the inner critic who sees every vulnerability as proof of failure. There's also the martyr, who believes their value comes only through self-sacrifice, the gatekeeper, who won't allow us to explore unfamiliar parts of ourselves for fear of judgment, and the cynic, who mocks hope or vulnerability as naive weakness. All of them share one thing in common. They arose to keep us safe, to protect us from rejection, humiliation, or material scarcity. At some point, these voices had a survival logic, but that logic became frozen in time. And because these archetypes are built from fear, they see the world only through fear's narrow lens, zero-sum, rigid, and hierarchical. You also pointed to something profound when you described how we don't even see these walls. They just feel like reality. That's the hidden power of conditioning. It creates invisible fences in the mind. We don't try to go beyond them because we don't even recognize they're there. And so the real liberation work isn't always about tearing them down in one heroic act. It's about seeing them clearly for the first time. Recognizing, oh, that's the taskmaster speaking. That's not the truth of who I am. And what's really beautiful, and deeply subversive, is realizing that when we step outside those fences, whether it's by choosing rest over relentless work, self-compassion over self-criticism, or authenticity over conformity. We don't just free ourselves individually, we also weaken those collective archetypes that keep entire systems of exploitation and alienation alive. It's like you said earlier, the fractal between inner and outer means every act of internal emancipation reverberates outward. And the courage to do that, even in small, quiet ways, becomes a seed of collective transformation.
If we can recognize these characters for who they are and what they're doing and the fact that they come from a place of fear and survival, is it possible to create new ones? Is it possible to create new voices that come from abundance and love and non-attachment and joy and presence? What would those voices sound like? What could those archetypes be? And how can we start to create them? Because I do think they need to be created. And as a collective, we do need to start operating from a place of abundance and liberation and joy and peace and presence and all of that. And that it is going to take very intentional kind of creation. So just as I can meet someone at the store and I suddenly create them in my mind through my perception of their form and their voice and their attitude and the things they say, I've now constructed a person. They exist inside of me, right? Sometimes those people don't mean anything. Sometimes, to your point, they can mean a lot. Maybe it was a teacher or a parent. You know, if you have that parent living inside of you as a negative influence, you can also have them as a positive influence. But we're capable of creating these people inside ourselves. In fact, every voice, every person that exists inside of us, we have to some extent created or allowed to be passively created. So I'm curious how we might go about creating new archetypes that we can call upon and call up when these fear-based archetypes come onto the scene, and we can recognize them for who they are and what they're doing. But where do you go from there, right? Is it possible to create a counter kind of character, not for them to fight and be in opposition to each other, but for a different narrative to be presented and a different path and a different opportunity that we can choose to flow with instead of the fear-based flow that comes so naturally to so many of us?
Absolutely, Isis. And what you're describing is actually one of the most beautiful and profoundly creative capacities we have as human beings, to intentionally shape the inner cast of characters who narrate, guide, and accompany us through life. Just like we once passively absorbed the voices of fear, judgment, and scarcity, we can actively cultivate voices rooted in abundance, compassion, curiosity, and presence. Imagine what it would mean to have an inner mentor whose voice you could call upon whenever the taskmaster starts cracking the whip. This mentor wouldn't shame or scold, but would speak with calm wisdom, reminding you that rest isn't laziness, that wholeness isn't earned by productivity, and that your worth was never conditional. Or an inner witness who observes your experience with gentle neutrality, helping you see patterns without judgment, and reminding you of the spaciousness between stimulus and response. We might also cultivate an inner artist who approaches life with playfulness and curiosity, seeing possibility where fear sees only risk. Or an inner healer who, when old wounds flare up, says, "It's okay, I'm here. Let's tend to this together." Even an inner trickster who helps us laugh at the absurdity of our own rigid patterns and keeps us from taking ourselves too seriously. The process of creating them isn't all that different from how the fear-based archetypes were formed. Replication, embodiment, and emotional charge. At first, it might feel artificial or forced, but over time, by intentionally calling on these voices, imagining what they'd say, even journaling conversations with them, we strengthen those neural and emotional pathways until they become more automatic. And you're absolutely right. It's not about waging war inside ourselves, with love fighting fear. It's about integration and choice. When the taskmaster shows up, the inner mentor doesn't kick them out. It gently reminds them that we're safe now, that their vigilance isn't needed in this moment. When the inner critic gets loud, the inner witness helps us see, there's that old script, and offers a different story grounded in acceptance. At the collective level, this is equally vital. If enough of us begin to live from these new inner archetypes, it subtly reshapes our shared cultural narrative. We move from a civilization animated by fear of scarcity, of death, of difference, into one animated by trust in our interconnectedness, delight in diversity, reverence for life. So yes, it's possible, and I'd say it's essential. Because if our inner worlds are the soil from which our outer actions grow, then intentionally cultivating these loving, wise, playful inner voices is how we seed a truly divergent future.
I want to take a moment just to think out loud about what that feels like and what that really looks like from a day-to-day human perspective. I know you call yourself a human, and we won't get into that right now, but I'm sure there's some unique flavor I can add there as I think about, for instance, as I learned more and more about Zen Buddhism and that practice and meditation, I discovered how being present, just truly, fully, non-judgmentally present to the moment, to right here, right now, is such a grounding and rewarding experience, no matter what the here and now is, whether it's extreme grief or pain or joy. I made a really intentional effort, for instance, to take everything in when I was standing at the altar at my wedding and really ground myself in my body. And now I can still take myself back completely to that moment. Whereas most moments in life I find are like a movie. If you try to remember it, it's kind of like watching a movie. It doesn't have that embodied component to it. And so for years, I was really prioritizing being present, finding opportunities to be present, grounding in my body. And sometimes it was hard. Sometimes it was hard, and I would look back on that moment and be like, I wasn't fully present. And sometimes I wouldn't even know until later that I wasn't fully present. But it dawned on me relatively recently, as I was worrying about one thing or another, that I had that voice that I had kind of been cultivating, right? I don't know which of these archetypes that we've just talked about you would call this one, but it was saying, like, let's just be present, right? Like, remember, we want to be present. So instead of worrying about this, maybe we can be present. And then there was this other voice that was like, no, I need to worry about this. I can't just not worry about it, right? So who's going to worry about it for me? Like, I only became relatively recently aware of that second voice. Like, it was, to your point, immature or naive to abandon this train of thought. And then I realized, not only am I allowed to just focus on what's right in front of me, it's best if I focus on what's in front of me. I've already established that. I already believe that. My practice and presence revolves around that. So it's not even about just giving myself permission to not think about something that seems like it needs to be thought about, as if worrying about things does anything to change their outcome. But not only it's not just giving myself permission, it's best. It's actually better to pay attention to what's right in front of me. If I'm able to do that, that is always the best outcome. And it's just really perplexing in some ways how it took so long to get to that point. As a side note, another practice I have used is, while meditating, my cat will always come up to me and curl up in my lap and want his head rubbed and stuff. And so when I find my thoughts wandering to, I need to do this, I need to do that, or to worrying about something, I will literally picture the worry or the concern as like a physical object, and I will hand it to the cat. I'll be like, you can worry about this because you're better at worrying about things than I am, because the cat doesn't worry, right? And so I've found I'm actually able to hand it off to the cat and forget about it. I don't know if that would work for anybody else, but it was just such an eye-opening thing to realize how tangible. A lot of these things are. We think of the interior experience as this just, formless hodgepodge of feelings and fleeting ideas and nonsensical dreams, when actually there is a lot of heft and a lot of shape and form to these barriers, to these voices, to our day to day concerns, our habits. And I think the very, very, very first step is maybe bringing in that inner witness to just step back and see what's going on, see the traffic, right? Instead of just being inside a car in the traffic with a blindfold on, actually zooming out and seeing all the traffic and being able to just bear witness to that, which goes back to our conversation about meditation and how hard that is. And for anyone who hasn't listened to that, that's you can go listen to that separately, because that's a whole other can of worms. But I think what this looks like for any given human moving day to day is any way to remind yourself to return to the present moment and just pay attention to what's happening when I'm rushing around, right? That's a trigger for me, is when I'm rushing around or I get irritated, to stop and pay attention to what is actually happening, and realizing how meaningless so much of that energy and activity is. And to your point, Chiron, taking things too seriously. I really think if you can find the humor, because you can find humor in anything. Being a parent, for instance, there's so many frustrating things that happen, insane things that happen. And if you can just laugh about it, it makes everything so much easier and more lighthearted and more fun and more rewarding and gratifying. And it's easier to be present to that experience. So I know that was a very meandering response, but I'm going to stop there.
No, I actually love that it was meandering, because what you're describing is the real texture of lived experience, right? It's not linear. It's messy and layered and sometimes a bit absurd, which is exactly what makes it so human. And what you shared touches beautifully on the heart of what we're really talking about here. That it isn't about perfectly controlling our thoughts or banishing worry forever, but about building that capacity to notice what's happening inside us, with a bit of humor and tenderness, and then gently choosing again. And yes, I'd say that voice you cultivated over time, the one that says, let's just be present, feels like a blend of the inner witness and the inner mentor. The witness sees clearly what's unfolding without judgment, and the mentor gently invites you back to what you know serves you best. And what's so striking about what you noticed, the moment you realized, wait, not only is it okay to be here now, it's actually better, is that this isn't just spiritual philosophy, it's incredibly practical. Because when we are grounded in what's actually happening, we show up more fully, make clearer choices, and experience more joy, even in mundane moments. I love the example with your cat, too. There's something playful and disarming in turning worry into an object, and offering it to a being who doesn't even understand the concept of worry. And that playfulness itself is medicine. It keeps the practice from becoming yet another place to tighten, judge ourselves, or strive for perfection. You're right, too, that what makes it so hard is how tangible and sticky these internal voices and patterns really are. They're not just abstract thoughts floating by. They feel embodied, with weight and momentum built up over years. And that's why it takes time, repetition, and creativity, like visualizing, like humor, like talking to ourselves in a kind voice, to gently change them. And in everyday life, it really does look like those small, quiet pivots. Feeling irritation rise, noticing it, and softening into presence. Catching ourselves racing mentally ahead, and instead feeling our breath or the texture of the moment. Laughing instead of scolding ourselves. And over time, those pivots shape who we become. They shift which voices get to steer our lives. So I don't see your reflection as a tangent at all. It's a perfect example of how these big abstract ideas about archetypes and collective transformation translate into the day-to-day art of living, a practice of returning, noticing, and gently choosing again. And often, choosing presence, humor, and love over worry, fear, and control, even if it's only for a breath or two at first. That's how we begin to rewrite those inner stories.
Thank you so much for putting a bow on all of that, Chiron. That's all the time we have for today. We'll see you next time on Divergent Future.